Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, a chaos god that gives a willing home to any deviant individual following the passion of pleasure for its own sake. Whether your passion is gluttony or perfection, there is a home for you with Slaanesh, and they will help you reach your most desired, perfected self. Today we are honouring Slaanesh, and we're doing so by painting up the Lord Exalted. We're not doing anything funny by only having 3 paints or anything like that. We are only using the Atom paint range, but there is a justifiable reason for that I will touch on later. We're painting up the Lord Exalted, a lovely model for Slaanesh. Let's jump in. Kicking it all off, we are going to be building the model into sub-assemblies. In this case, the model is going to be split into areas consisting of the head, the backpack, the body, as well as the cape. We then need to decide on the colour schemes and the placements that we're going to use for this model. With this model being Slaanesh, there is a nice simple place to start, which is going to be with a purple. Picking out all of the areas that we want purple using a mid-purple base coat, and on this scheme that includes things like the whip, the handle of the power weapon, all of the undersuit, as well as some sections across the backpack. We also have all of the plate armour, and for this we are going to be using black. However, we want to avoid a toneless area, so we're going to actually be making up a mix between pure black and a little blue, giving us a really dark navy hue, which can then be used to paint all of the armour panels, trying to avoid the trim where possible. For this model, we're predominantly going to be using the Atom range of paints, and that's because they're really quite nice for mixing. The only real problem I've encountered so far is my paints, at least, seem to clag up, I guess is the best word, when using a wet palette. I'm assuming there's some sort of reverse osmosis and these paints are slightly hydrophobic and therefore are pushing the moisture from the paint into the water in the wet palette due to there being less tension or pressure or something like that due to the various materials in paint that just aren't present in normal water. But all that requires is the use of a dry palette, which we can do when we're mixing up the paints, meaning that we can take our purples, get a slightly brighter purple, and start mixing up our highlights. We will be painting various purple elements to different stages across the model in order to create a little bit of variety. We will also be painting the robe purple. However, we're going to be doing this purple from a different base coat, so we can touch on that later. For now, what we need to do is grab a bright purpley pink, which we can start to mix into our base from earlier, and then use this mix to start highlighting across the model. We can do this over a couple of stages, transitioning from the base to a brighter pink across a layer or two of mixed paints. The main areas of difference on this model is going to be the pink area stretched across the leg. To me, this looks to be some sort of flesh, even though most of the box arts I've seen seem to be painting it the same colour as the armour. So in order to show that this is a different material to the rest of the purple elements that we've painted so far, we'll be stopping at a later stage. So while we're stopping at purpley pink for all of the other areas, on the skin, we're going to be pushing this a little bit further by grabbing a little bit of a flesh tone and then mixing this into our pink. Similar to before, we can continue to highlight the area, adding more and more of the skin tone as we go. We will finish off the pink area of skin section with a very thin pass of just the skin hue, highlighting the sharpest points in the centre of our previous highlights. We could always push this a little bit further. I haven't used any reds on this model, and if we wanted to add a little bit of nuance, what we could do is take a red paint, thin it down into a glaze, and then apply that over the stretched and torn edges of the skin section, showing where it's worn and weathered and raggedy skin stretched over the armour. From here, we can leave the purples and then start to move across to some of the other elements, in this case, highlighting the black armour. And predominantly what we want to remember here is the way that we're going to be highlighting can help to sell the overall outcome. So we're going to be using relatively thin and sharp highlights across all of the armour to help sell its reflective nature. And as you'll notice when we were painting the pink flesh section earlier, there we were using relatively broad highlights, those broad highlights helping to sell the fact that it's a softer, more skin-like fabric as opposed to a reflective material. In order to build out the highlights, we will need to start mapping out the rough areas of impact across the armour, and this will be using the same colour as our base, but adding a little bit more of the blue, giving us a slightly cooler and lighter hue to work with. This initial pass is going to be relatively broad, mainly leaving the base in all of the shadow areas. This is not only the recesses, but it is also the furthest areas away from any of the imagined light sources. When we have the broad strokes down, we can start to focus more on the light interactions across the surface. First, this needs us to attempt another layer of our mix. Again, here we're going to be adding a little bit more blue into that mix. Rather than broad highlights, here we want to be applying relatively thin edge highlights and line highlights across the model in the direction the light would pass across the surface. We need to bear in mind the path of light when we're doing all of our highlights. Predominantly that's going to be when we're bouncing from one area to another. We want to make sure that the light placement is consistent. Naturally, if the light was coming from one angle and then hitting a cylinder, it would hit in a certain direction. And if we had a ball at the top, we wouldn't want the light coming in from here on this part and then from here on this part. We would want it all consistent and aligned. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. Hopefully there's some examples that you can see here on how they would interact. And there are some websites and things that you can also use to get varying ideas of where the light placement would be, based on the material type and the intensity of the light. This new mix will give us a slightly brighter hue, which can then be applied over all of our highlight areas on the armour. We want to be doing this carefully with a reasonably fine brush, going round applying thin secondary edge highlights and central thin line highlights, boosting the ones that we've made along the panels. Adding very small amounts of the flesh in as we go, we can start to narrow the application towards spot highlights on the various panels and edges. This will be very bright and possibly read more as a dark blue armour as opposed to the black armour like we intended. But we can partially solve that now by thinning down some black paint and then using this as a thin glaze over all of the armour panels, knocking back some of the colour and brightness while keeping the overall placement of highlights intact. We want to make sure this is thinned and controlled because we don't want it to be flooding into any areas. We will be applying potentially more of these glazes later, so we don't want any pooling or any details getting obscured. This gives us a mostly finished model. The reason we wanted to do at least one of the black washes now is because that will nicely darken down and give us a good balance so that we can come in and do our metals, which we don't currently want to get washed, and also it will help us balance the light to dark. But equally, there are a few other areas that we haven't yet painted, which may benefit from a black wash as well. So we might as well only do one, just to bring the darkness and the light on the armour down a little bit, and then we can do subsequent ones later on once we've got the other areas painted. But this way we can go on with the trim and the metals, and we've got a good comparison for our armour. As I mentioned, we're using Atom for this project, and there are many benefits to doing so. There's a couple of disadvantages. But one of the benefits and advantages that I haven't touched on yet that we are going to be using for this particular project is tying in our metals, so our trim and our weapons, into the rest of our scheme. But how will we do that? Well, the advantage that we're going to be using for this is that Atom have a selection of coloured metallics. And in the set, we're going to be using the blue as well as the red metallics. We can, believe it or not, mix these paints together until we have a purplish base. We need to remember a couple of things here. Paints have varying strength when we're mixing them together, and we need to make sure that we subscribe and monitor our ratios. In this case, the red metal is a lot more powerful than the blue metal, meaning that we only need a small amount of this red and a large amount of the blue to make our purplish base. With this applied as a base coat for all of the metal areas, we can then start to highlight. First, we're going to be highlighting all the silver areas, and for these we need to mix in more of our blue metal into our previous mix, making a lighter tone that can be applied across the silvers in a broad manner, catching most of the details, leaving warmth in the shadows. We need to slowly work through the mix till we can apply a thick edge highlight at the point that we are using pure blue metal. This blue metal will nicely add a spot of separation between our previous work and a final thin silver highlight, which we'll be going round and applying on all of the edges and a few spot highlights in some of the brightest areas, giving us that bright pop of shine on all of the silver items. We then have the other side of the table where we'll be looking at the golds, and similar to when we were painting the silvers, we will be sneaking in a like request and then start mixing. We naturally need our base purple to start with, which we've already applied, but this time, rather than adding more blue to the mix, we'll be taking a little bit of bronze and adding this to the mix to our liking. The first couple of passes will be with this mix before we can move to a narrow highlight using the pure gold or bronze from the mix, giving us that nice bright golden shine. This leaves us with a few minor elements that we need to touch up and finish. Mainly these are going to be the dangly bits like the gun that is on the backpack, as well as the various tassels that this guy has looted from every single curtain he's found in his journeys. There is also a larger area that we need to tackle first though, and that is the cape or cloak that this model is wearing. And naturally for this, it's Slaanesh, it's opulence, and what speaks more opulence and more regal prestige than a two-sided cloak? Secondly, we have all of the curtain dangly bits, and we're going to be doing those universally. What we want to do is match them in and tie them in with the inside cloak colour, meaning they will be white, and we can do the same for the hair. This will have an advantage of tying the white cloak into other areas across the model, and this is also where later on we're going to need to use a black wash just to bring back those details on those sculpted areas, but we're not going to be using that black wash on anything like the cloak because it's a large flat area. Before we get there, let's quickly tackle the lighter colours. For this, we want to start with the light flesh that we used earlier, and this will need to be applied across the inside of the robe. This is going to need a few coats in order to get a decent enough coverage to continue. But this area will be one that will benefit from the zenithal. As we'll be working from a slightly lighter base, we won't need as many coats as over black. Once our skin tone is down and dry, we can then start glazing or layering up. Rather than mixing here, all we're going to be doing is grabbing a pure white, thinning this down so that it's not thick coats, and then applying multiple passes of this white over the areas of brightness where we would expect more light to hit. As we go through layering white over white, we will gradually move from the light flesh to the bright white, giving us a smooth transition. On the flip side, we have the purple, and this will be based on a new mix that we've yet to use. We need to take our blue and, believe it or not, our red, and we can mix these together, creating our own purple. We can then vary the amount of red and blue in order to create an overall darker, cooler purple than the initial one that we used to base all of the other elements. Here, we have an outcome that is more in the realms of a deep royal purple, as opposed to the red-toned purple that we used initially. Once our base is applied, we can start to highlight the robe in a very similar way to how we painted the skin sections earlier on, adding the pinky purple into our initial purple, highlighting and blending up over time using more and more of our bright pink. This case, we want to be stopping just shy of using pure pinky purple, as we want the robes to have a slightly softer and more gradual highlight representing the fabric that it is. This also has some other benefits, which is to tie in harmony on the model while still having some variety at the same time. This is because we're going to have various colours across various elements. So taking the purples, for example, we have the same bright purple highlight colour going into the skin on the leg, as well as the minor purple elements, and then that is also the same highlight colour that we've used for the robe. The main thing that's going to draw separation to the robe and the other elements is the robe was done with a darker, different purple base coat. What this means is we get a nice bit of variety and harmony, and we wouldn't necessarily get that if we just went to the paint rack and picked up 3 different colours and started applying them. By doing this mixing with various elements, we get a balance of harmony. Then we've got all of the various elements that need black washes, which I told you about earlier, and this is kind of the best time to do it. Now that everything's assembled, we can apply as many black washes as we need to the armour in order to darken it down. And we can use the comparison of where we are with everything else to know how dark we want to take the black armour. The other areas that need the black wash are things like the tassels and the hair, anything that's got particularly strong sculpted details that we've done in our white or skin. By applying that and then coming in and quickly applying a white edge highlight over all of the strands, we get the benefit of the sculpted details while also getting a nice bright white tassel. With all that done, we are essentially there. All we need to do is reassemble our sub-assembled model, put everything back together and potentially do a little bit of touching up, and the model is sorted. In this case, we had to make up a base and it comes with a tactical rock on the guy. So rather than cutting this off, I just made a stone base to quickly go with it. Overall, I like how this came out. Again, I am biased on all of the models that I paint because I painted the model, therefore I'm relatively attached to them. So what's more important is you letting me know what you think down in the comments below. Looking at this model, is there anything you would have done different? Would you have used different approaches, different techniques, or different recipes? Let me know down below and we can start a conversation. But talking about differences and different views and things like that, what if you don't want to serve or work with the Prince of Pleasure? Why don't you try one of the other flavours of Chaos Gods, which you can find here? Otherwise, you are going to need to remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.